You are standing on a riverbank in northern Korea, summer of 612 CE, watching the largest invasion force Asia has ever assembled march past you. For 6 days, columns of Sui Dynasty soldiers have crossed this shallow river, 300,000 men, maybe more, their armor glinting in the afternoon sun like a metal sea flowing north. The water barely reaches their knees. Children could wade across it. But you notice something strange. The river is dropping. Every hour, the waterline recedes another inch down the muddy banks. By the 6th day, you can walk across on exposed stones without wetting your boots. The Sui general leading the rearguard notices too, but he's got 100,000 men still waiting to cross, and his emperor's orders are explicit. Take the Goguryeo capital or don't come back. So he pushes them forward into the riverbed, into what will become the grave of an empire. If you enjoy history that refuses to stay buried, subscribe. We're just getting started. The Sui dynasty didn't just want to conquer Goguryeo. They needed to. Emperor Yang had spent 7 years building canals, roads, and the administrative machinery of a unified China. But his northern border remained a problem that gnawed at his legitimacy. Goguryeo, a Korean kingdom that controlled territory from the Korean peninsula deep into Manchuria, had grown powerful enough to threaten Chinese cities, raid border regions, and worst of all, ignore Sui diplomatic demands. For a Chinese emperor claiming the mandate of heaven, this was intolerable. Tributary states were supposed to bow. Goguryeo stood straight. Yang assembled an invasion force that makes most ancient armies look like raiding parties. The numbers from Chinese chronicles are staggering. 1,133,800 soldiers. Even if we assume bureaucratic inflation and cut that in half, we're still looking at the largest military expedition ancient Asia had ever mounted, comparable in scale to Darius's invasion of Greece or Xerxes crossing the Hellespont. The logistical achievement alone is breathtaking. Yang's engineers had built a supply network stretching from central China to the Liaodong Peninsula, with grain depots, weapon stockpiles, and relay stations positioned every 50 miles. His fleet controlled the Yellow Sea. His cavalry numbered in the tens of thousands. His siege equipment included towers that took 100 men to move. Consider what this mobilization meant in practical terms. Every soldier needed roughly 2 pounds of grain per day. At 500,000 men, a conservative estimate, that's 1 million pounds of food daily, or 500 tons. For a 3-month campaign, the Sui needed to transport and store 45,000 tons of grain alone, not counting meat, salt, vegetables, or fodder, for tens of thousands of horses and oxen. The supply caravans stretched for miles, vulnerable to raids at every mountain pass. Yang's bureaucrats requisitioned grain from across the empire, triggering food shortages that would simmer into rebellion within years. The invasion was bleeding China dry before a single battle. The Sui army wasn't just large, it was a moving city with its own economy, hierarchy, and infrastructure. They brought blacksmiths to repair weapons, carpenters to build siege equipment, doctors to treat wounds, scribes to document victories, and priests to perform rituals. The command structure included dozens of generals, each controlling divisions that numbered in the thousands. Communication between units relied on drums, flags, and mounted messengers, systems that worked well in open Chinese plains but would prove disastrously slow in Goguryeu's mountainous terrain. It was a demonstration of imperial power designed to terrify enemies into submission before the fighting even started. Tributary states along the route watched the army pass and sent immediate messages pledging loyalty to the Sui. Yang calculated that Goguryeo would see this overwhelming force and capitulate rather than face annihilation. It was psychological warfare at continental scale. The problem? It only works if your enemy is rational enough to be terrified. Goguryeo had perhaps 300,000 total population. They could field maybe 30,000 trained soldiers if they stripped every fort and called up every able man from the farms. The math was impossible. Chinese strategists predicted the campaign would take 3 months. 1 month to cross into Goguryeo territory, 1 month to besiege the capital Pyongyang, 1 month to secure the peninsula. Yang had even brought craftsmen to design victory monuments. The outcome seemed so certain that Sui officers were already arguing about which provinces they'd be awarded as rewards. But Goguryeo had been playing this game for centuries. Founded in 37 BCE, the kingdom had survived and thrived by mastering the art of strategic defense against larger powers. They'd fought off Chinese invasions before the Han Dynasty tried twice, the Wei Dynasty tried multiple times, and each campaign had bled itself out against Goguryeu's combination of mountainous terrain, guerrilla tactics, and sheer, stubborn refusal to submit. The kingdom had developed a military culture that prioritized mobility, local knowledge, and the ability to outlast rather than outfight invaders. Their fortifications reflected this defensive philosophy. Goguryeu's mountain fortresses weren't massive stone structures designed to withstand prolonged siege. They were networks of wooden forts positioned on peaks and ridges, designed to be abandoned and reoccupied as tactical situations changed. Soldiers could retreat from one fort, let the enemy occupy it, then retake it a week later after the invaders moved on. This strategy turned the entire kingdom into a maze, where every victory cost more than it gained. The Goguryeo army itself was built differently than Chinese forces. Where the Sui relied on massive infantry formations and heavy cavalry, Goguryeo specialized in light cavalry and archers who could harass, retreat, and strike again. Their soldiers knew every mountain pass, every river crossing, every place where a large army would be forced to bunch up vulnerably. They'd grown up hunting in these mountains, knew which plants were edible, which streams were drinkable. For them, terrain wasn't an obstacle, it was a weapon. But Goguryeo had two specific advantages the Sui hadn't accounted for. First, they knew their terrain the way you know your own house in the dark. The kingdom was mostly mountains and rivers, natural fortifications that turned every valley into a potential death trap for invaders who didn't know the land. Second, they had a general named Eulji Mundeok, who understood something profound about Chinese military culture. Overwhelming force makes armies stupid. When you have numerical superiority that massive, you stop thinking about tactics and start thinking about inevitability. You get careless. Eulji Mundeok didn't try to stop the Sui invasion at the border. That would have been suicide. Instead, he pulled his forces back, abandoned settlements, and let the massive Chinese army roll north like a flood. For weeks, the Sui encountered almost no resistance. Small Goguryeo units would appear on ridgelines, shoot a few arrows, then vanish into the forests. Forts that should have been defended were found empty, grain stores burned, bridges destroyed. The Sui supply lines stretched longer and longer. The easy victories felt wrong to some of the Chinese officers, but what were they going to do complain about winning? By July, the Sui vanguard had pushed deep into Goguryeo territory, almost to Pyongyang itself. They'd covered hundreds of miles with relatively light casualties. Emperor Yang's plan seemed to be working, but the army's logistics were starting to fray. The supply convoys were taking weeks to reach the front lines. Soldiers were on half rations. The summer heat was brutal, and diseases were spreading through camps that had been occupied too long. Still, victory seemed close enough to endure the discomfort. The psychological toll was worse than the physical hardship. Soldiers were exhausted not from fighting, but from constant vigilance. Every night brought raids. Every forest could hide archers. Every abandoned village felt like a trap. The easy victories that should have boosted morale instead created a creeping paranoia. Why weren't the Goguryeo forces defending their own territory? What were they planning? Chinese veterans who'd fought in other campaigns started muttering that something felt wrong about this invasion. The younger soldiers, promised glory and plunder, were starting to realize they were hundreds of miles from home, with dwindling supplies and no clear victory in sight. The Sui command structure was fracturing under the strain. Different generals had different theories about Goguryeo strategy. Some argued for an immediate assault on Pyongyang before supplies ran out. Others insisted they should consolidate their position and wait for reinforcement. A few suggested retreating to the border and regrouping. Emperor Yang's orders from distant China were weeks old by the time they arrived, based on situations that had already changed. So field commanders made decisions that contradicted each other, sending mixed signals down the chain of command and creating confusion about what the overall strategy actually was. That's when Eulji Mundeok sent a letter, not to Emperor Yang, to the Sui field commander, a general named Yuan Shu. The letter was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as poetry. Eulji wrote in classical Chinese verse, demonstrating his education and cultural sophistication, subtly reminding the Sui that they weren't fighting barbarians, but a civilized kingdom with centuries of literary tradition. He praised Yuan's military brilliance, acknowledged that Goguryeo was overmatched, and suggested that perhaps an honorable peace could be negotiated now that the Sui had demonstrated their overwhelming power. The subtext was clear. You've proven your point, so go home with honor before this gets ugly. The letter hit the Sui command like a psychological grenade. Some generals read it as a sign of Goguryeo desperation and pushed for immediate assault on Pyongyang. See, they're ready to surrender. We just need to press harder. Others, more experienced in frontier warfare, sensed a trap if Eulji is offering peace. It's because he thinks he can win. Why else would a commander with 30,000 men send respectful poetry to an enemy with hundreds of thousands? The disagreement paralyzed the command structure for days, with various factions arguing their position while supplies continued to dwindle and raids continued every night. Yuan Shu finally made his decision: retreat. Not because he was afraid, but because the strategic situation was untenable. His army was exhausted, undersupplied, and hundreds of miles from reinforcement. Taking Pyongyang would require a siege lasting months, and he didn't have months of food. Better to withdraw now, resupply, and invade again the following spring with proper preparation. It was the tactically sound choice. It was also exactly what Eulji Mundeok had been waiting for. A retreating army is always vulnerable. Morale drops because soldiers feel like they're admitting defeat even if they're not. Unit cohesion loosens because the tight formation required for defense becomes a slow-moving column vulnerable to harassment. Most critically, the psychological dynamic reverses. The army that was hunting becomes the army being hunted. Eulji Mundeok had spent weeks pulling back to lure the Sui deeper. Now he would spend weeks pursuing them to destroy them completely. The Goguryeo harassment began small. Arrows from tree lines, night raids on supply wagons. Nothing the Sui couldn't handle, but enough to keep them tense and exhausted. The Chinese army had to post guards constantly, which meant nobody slept properly. They had to maintain combat formations while marching, which meant covering maybe half the ground they would in peacetime. Every river crossing took hours because soldiers bunched up nervously, expecting ambush. The retreat that should have taken 3 weeks took 6. By late July, the Sui army had made it back to the Salsu River, modern-day Chongcheon River, in North Korea. This was where they'd crossed heading north 6 weeks earlier. The vanguard reached the river first, around July 8th, and immediately noticed the water level was lower than before. Not alarmingly low, just noticeably down. The river was maybe 50 feet wide here, normally 3 or 4 feet deep, now barely covering the rocks. Soldiers waded across easily, filled their canteens, kept moving south towards safety and supply depots. For 6 days, the Sui army crossed in segments, first the vanguard, then the main body, then the siege equipment, then the rear guard. This was standard procedure for an army that size. You don't funnel 300,000 men through one river crossing in an afternoon. The process takes time, but each day, soldiers waiting to cross noticed the water dropping further. By day 3, the river was ankle deep. By day 5, the riverbed was mostly exposed. Veterans in the rear guard started asking questions. Where's the water going? July is monsoon season. In Korea, rivers should be rising, not falling. Nobody had an answer because nobody was looking upstream. 40 miles north, at a narrow gorge where the Salsu passed through steep hills, Eulji Mundeok had spent weeks doing something that wouldn't be recognized as possible until modern engineers started building dams. His men had constructed a massive earthwork barrier across the river, using logs, stones, and packed earth to create a temporary dam. It wasn't sophisticated engineering by modern standards, just a growing wall of debris that slowly choked the river's flow. The gorge provided natural walls on both sides, meaning the dam only needed to span maybe 80 feet to completely block the flow. The work was done at night to avoid Sui aerial reconnaissance, if you can call a few scouts on distant hilltops aerial reconnaissance. The construction process itself was a testament to Goguryeo organizational capacity. Thousands of soldiers worked in shifts, each team hauling logs from nearby forests, rolling boulders from the hillsides, packing mud and vegetation into gaps. They built the dam in layers, starting with a foundation of large stones at the riverbed, then adding progressively smaller material as the wall grew higher. Every few feet of height, they'd compact the structure by having hundreds of men march across the top, tamping down the earth with their weight. It was backbreaking work done in secrecy, with constant fear that Sui scouts would discover the operation. The water backed up behind the dam day by day, forming a reservoir miles long. At first, the pooling was barely noticeable, just the river widening slightly. But as the dam grew taller and the blockage became more complete, the reservoir began to resemble a small lake. Fish died in the still water. Trees along the original banks were inundated. Goguryeo engineers monitoring the dam knew they were creating something with enormous destructive potential, a weapon that had never been used in warfare before. They calculated roughly, without modern instruments, that the reservoir might hold several million cubic feet of water by the time the Sui army reached the killing zone downstream. The engineering challenge wasn't just building the dam. It was building a dam that would hold long enough to trap the maximum number of enemy soldiers, but would fail catastrophically on command. Too weak, and it might collapse prematurely while only the vanguard was crossing. Too strong, and it might hold indefinitely, wasting all their effort. Eulji's engineers solved this by incorporating deliberate weak point sections, where logs were less tightly packed, where the foundation was intentionally shallow. These would be the first sections to fail when the time came to release the flood. Thousands of Goguryeo soldiers worked in shifts, piling more material onto the dam, making it higher and thicker. They could see the water level rising behind them day by day, creeping up the gorge walls, turning a rushing river into a still, ominous pool. They knew what was coming. They knew that downstream, Sui soldiers were walking into a trap that would be visible only when it was far too late to escape. The last Sui units entered the riverbed around midday on July 14th. Roughly 100,000 men were either in the river, on its banks, or within a few hundred yards of the crossing point. The formation was spread out along a mile of riverbed, with soldiers bunched up in the slowest sections where siege equipment had to be manhandled across. The day was hot and cloudless. Most men had removed their armor to make the crossing easier, planning to put it back on once they reached the southern bank. Some were eating, some were refilling water skins. A few officers on horseback were shouting at stragglers to keep moving. It was controlled chaos, the kind of disorder that happens when a massive army transitions from one formation to another. Then soldiers upstream started pointing and yelling. The wave appeared as a sound first, a rumble that didn't make sense, like distant thunder but deeper and continuous, building in volume until it became a roar that drowned out shouted commands. Then it came into view around the river's bend. A wall of water 6 feet high, brown with churned earth and debris, moving fast. Someone had broken Eulji Mundeok's dam. Whether it collapsed under pressure or was deliberately destroyed at the perfect moment by soldiers hacking away the weak points they'd built into the structure, we don't know. What we do know is that millions of gallons of backed up water hit the Sui army with the force of a tidal wave crashing into a narrow channel. The physics of flash flooding in a riverbed are brutal and unforgiving. Water doesn't flow, it explodes. The leading edge of the flood hit the densest part of the Sui formation at roughly 15 miles per hour, which doesn't sound that fast until you remember water is heavy and incompressible. A cubic foot of water weighs 62 pounds. Multiply that by millions of cubic feet moving together, and you have a force that tosses armored men like leaves. The wave struck the northern section of the army first, hitting soldiers who were still crossing or gathering on the northern bank. They had seconds to react. Some turned and ran, but you can't outrun water in a narrow valley. Some tried to grab onto trees or rocks, but the current ripped them away. Some just stood there, frozen by incomprehension, brains unable to process what their eyes were seeing. The initial impact was like being hit by a moving wall. Soldiers in the direct path described those few who survived to describe anything, feeling their feet swept out from under them, then being tumbled in darkness, unable to tell which direction was up. The water was filled with debris, uprooted trees, pieces of the dam itself, rocks the size of skulls. These became projectiles, battering bodies that were already struggling against the current. Men tried to surface for air and were immediately pushed under again by the next surge. The waves swept them downstream like debris. Men in full armor vanished immediately, dragged under by the weight of their own protection. Each soldier wore maybe 40 pounds of iron chest plates, helmets, arm guards. In normal conditions, this protection was life-saving. In a flash flood, it became an anchor. They sank straight to the bottom of the churning water, unable to remove the armor in the seconds they had before drowning. Their bodies would be found weeks later, miles downstream, still locked in their battle gear. Men without armor lasted longer, but not much. The current was too strong to swim against, filled with tumbling rocks and uprooted trees that functioned like battering rams. You'd surface, gasp for air, see another soldier a few feet away also struggling, and then a log would slam into both of you with enough force to break ribs. Or you'd grab onto a tree branch thinking you'd found safety, and the next surge would snap the branch off. Horses thrashed and went under, their screams mixing with human screams to create a sound that haunted survivors for years. Wagon loads of supplies capsized, grain sacks burst, creating a muddy foam on the water's surface. Siege equipment that had taken months to build and weeks to transport simply disappeared into the churning water. Within 2 minutes of the wave's arrival, thousands of men were dead or drowning, and the battle hadn't even started. But the real killing started afterward, in the chaos that followed the flood. The soldiers further south, on what they thought was the safe side of the crossing, heard the roar and saw the water coming but didn't understand what they were seeing. Was this a natural flood? An attack? Where was the enemy? Officers tried to maintain order, screaming commands that couldn't be heard over the water's roar and the screams of drowning men. The chain of command that had held through weeks of retreat disintegrated in minutes. Subordinates stopped looking to their officers for guidance because the officers clearly didn't know what was happening either. The formation that had been loosely organized a minute ago completely fell apart. Imagine being a 20-year-old soldier from inland China who's never seen anything larger than a creek. You've marched for 2 months to get here. You're exhausted, hungry, and you've just watched a wall of water appear from nowhere and swallow half your regiment. Your sergeant is yelling something, but you can't hear him over the roar. The soldier next to you drops his spear and starts running uphill. Do you maintain formation, or do you follow him? Every instinct screams, follow him, because staying put feels like waiting to die. That's the moment armies break. When enough individuals make the same calculation that survival depends on abandoning military discipline, the collective entity called an army stops existing. You're just a crowd of scared men in uniform. Soldiers dropped their weapons and ran. The weapons weren't light. A spear with an iron head weighed 8 or 10 pounds. A sword weighed 3. When you're running for your life, that weight becomes unbearable fast. So you drop it, along with your shield, your helmet, anything that slows you down. Within minutes, the ground was littered with abandoned equipment. Some ran toward higher ground, which was the tactically sound choice to get above the flood level. Some ran parallel to the river, trying to stay ahead of the water. Some ran in circles because panic destroys spatial reasoning. Others froze completely, their brains overwhelmed by the combination of fear and sensory overload. These men just stood there while comrades streamed past them, unable to process what was happening, unable to make a decision about what to do. Psychologists now call this tonic immobility, a fear response seen in animals and humans when the threat is too overwhelming to fight or flee from. The fog of war is usually metaphorical. This time it was literal, a spray of mist and mud kicked up by the churning water that reduced visibility to yards. You couldn't see who was friend or enemy. You couldn't see which direction led to safety. Officers who tried to rally their men couldn't make themselves visible above the chaos. Mounted officers had an advantage in height, but their horses were terrified and hard to control. Some horses bolted, carrying their riders away from the battle entirely. Others reared and threw their riders into the mud. The sound was overwhelming. The flood's roar continued even after the initial wave passed because the river was now a churning torrent 5 times its normal size. Men screamed for help, screamed in pain, screamed for their comrades, screamed without words just to express terror. The combination created a wall of noise that made communication impossible and fear contagious. When you can hear thousands of people screaming, your nervous system interprets it as validation that maximum fear is appropriate. which makes you more frightened, which makes you scream, which makes others more frightened. It's a feedback loop of panic. That's when the Goguryeo attack began. Eulji Mundeok had positioned 20,000 men in the hills surrounding the crossing point, hidden in forests and behind ridgelines. They'd been waiting for days, watching the Sui army trickle across, holding their discipline while thousands of enemy soldiers passed below them. The hardest part of their job was the waiting, not engaging, when engaging would have been easier, trusting that their general's plan would work. Now they attacked into the chaos, hitting a disorganized, panicked mass of men who couldn't tell friend from enemy and didn't know which direction safety lay. The Goguryeo tactics were brutally simple. They didn't form elaborate battle lines or execute complex maneuvers. They just hit the Sui flanks from multiple directions simultaneously, creating the impression of being surrounded even though the actual Goguryeo numbers were relatively small. Archers positioned on ridgelines shot down into the valley, each arrow falling from above with enough force to penetrate armor. The psychological impact of being shot at from above is profound. You can't see where the arrows are coming from, can't charge uphill to engage the enemy, can only try to raise your shield and hope. But most Sui soldiers had dropped their shields minutes ago while fleeing. Cavalry units burst from tree lines, not to engage in pitched combat, but to scatter groups of soldiers trying to regroup. 100 horsemen appearing suddenly is enough to make 1,000 panicked infantrymen run again, even if those infantrymen could probably win a fight if they stood their ground. The cavalry would thunder through, causing chaos, then wheel around and disappear back into the forest before any organized resistance could form. Then they'd hit from a different direction 10 minutes later. The Sui soldiers never saw the same Goguryeo unit twice, which made them think they were facing a massive force rather than the same few thousand men attacking from different angles. The Goguryeo infantry moved in small, disciplined groups, targeting isolated pockets of Sui soldiers who'd separated from their main force. These weren't heroic duels or dramatic charges, just quick, efficient killings of exhausted men who'd lost their weapons. A group of 10 or 15 Goguryeo soldiers would surround a handful of Sui stragglers, finish them with spears or swords, then move on to the next group. The coordination required was impressive. Each Goguryeo unit knew their objective, knew the terrain, knew where other friendly units were positioned. They operated like wolves hunting deer, patient, efficient, coordinated, without needing constant communication. The psychological impact of being attacked while you're still processing a disaster is devastating beyond normal combat stress. Your brain is already overloaded trying to understand what just happened with the flood. You're exhausted from weeks of retreat and insufficient food. You're terrified because you just watched your comrades drown in front of you. You're probably injured or at least bruised from being knocked around by the flood's debris. And now arrows are coming from the tree line and you hear war cries in a language you don't understand and you don't know how many enemies there are or where your officers are or what you're supposed to do. That's when training fails completely. That's when soldiers stop being soldiers and become just scared humans, looking for any escape, any direction that feels like it might lead away from death. The massacre lasted into the evening. Goguryeo forces hunted scattered Sui groups through the hills, picking off men who'd thrown down their weapons and were just trying to flee south. The river valley became a graveyard of abandoned equipment and bodies. Chinese chronicles later claimed only 2,700 men from the rear guard made it back to Sui territory. Archaeological evidence suggests this might be exaggerated. Some groups likely escaped through alternate routes, but the casualty rate was catastrophic. Easily 50,000 dead, possibly twice that. Most didn't die in the flood itself. They died in the panic afterward. The Sui Dynasty never recovered from Salsu. Emperor Yang launched 2 more invasions of Goguryeo over the following years, each smaller and more desperate than the last, each ending in failure. The military and economic strain of the campaigns destabilized his empire. Rebellions broke out in the provinces. His own generals turned against him. By 618 CE, the Sui dynasty collapsed, replaced by the Tang dynasty, which immediately made peace with Goguryeo. The kingdom that was supposed to be conquered in 3 months had instead triggered the fall of one of China's most powerful dynasties. Walk along the Chongchon River today, and you'll find nothing marking what happened here. No monuments, no plaques, just a river that flows peacefully through farmland. Korean historians have identified the approximate location of the battle based on geographic descriptions in Chinese texts and the presence of certain place names that reference the flood. Local farmers occasionally dig up corroded weapons or fragments of armor when plowing fields. That's all that remains physically. But the strategic lessons of Salsu echo forward through 13 centuries of military history. Every major military academy teaches some version of what Eulji Mundeok understood. Numerical superiority means nothing if you can dictate where and when the battle happens. The Sui had every advantage: more men, better equipment, superior logistics, a unified command structure. They lost because they allowed themselves to be herded into a killing ground by an enemy who understood that sometimes the best weapon isn't steel, it's geography. And sometimes the deadliest force on a battlefield isn't the enemy army, it's the panic that turns soldiers into drowning men reaching for something to hold onto that isn't there. The flood killed thousands. The panic killed tens of thousands more. The distinction matters because it reveals something uncomfortable about human nature under pressure. We're far more dangerous to ourselves than any enemy could be. The Sui soldiers who made it back to China didn't die from wounds. They died fleeing from their own shadows, crushed by their own comrades, drowned because they forgot how to swim when terror took over. Eulji Mundeok didn't win by being a better fighter. He won by understanding that armies, like people, break from the inside. There's a moment in the Chinese histories where a surviving Sui officer describes trying to rally his men after the flood hit. He's screaming commands, his voice is gone, and he realizes nobody is listening. Not because they're disobeying, but because they can't hear anything except their own fear. He wrote that he watched the army dissolve like salt in water, just dispersed into individual terrified men who happened to be wearing the same uniform. The bonds of unit cohesion, which had held through weeks of retreat and harassment, snapped in minutes once the flood triggered genuine existential panic. We like to think modern militaries have solved this problem through better training and communication. But scratch the surface of any military disaster from the last century, and you'll find the same pattern. The moment when fear overwhelms discipline, when every man decides saving himself matters more than maintaining formation, when the mission is abandoned for the scramble to survive. It happened to French forces at Dien Bien Phu. It happened to American forces during the Bataan Death March. It happened to Soviet forces at Tannenberg. The uniforms change, the weapons change, but that moment when an army stops being an army, that's eternal. What Eulji Mundeok proved at Salsu is that if you can engineer that moment, if you can crack the psychological foundation that holds an army together, you don't need to match their numbers. You just need to make them destroy themselves. The Goguryeo forces probably killed directly, maybe a few thousand Sui soldiers in actual combat. But they created the conditions where the Sui killed tens of thousands of their own through panic-driven stampedes, drownings, and the complete collapse of unit cohesion. That's not just tactical genius. That's understanding war at a level that makes conventional strategy look primitive. If you've made it this far, you're someone who values the uncomfortable truths hiding in history. Subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more forgotten stories to uncover together. Thanks for watching.